On this episode of Mysteries and Scandals, we'll explore Lenny Bruce's public battle with censorship and his private battle with personal demons.
He was an addict, no question about it. He used heroin.
And we'll examine Lenny's impact on the world of comedy.
He turned comedy on its ass. An amazing artist, knew his craft better than most anyone who's ever worked as a comedian, and certainly the most courageous of all time.
Was he prosecuted for being obscene or persecuted for telling the truth? I'm A.J. Benza. Join me as we relive the triumphs and the tragedies that made Lenny Bruce the patron saint of sinful comedy. Lenny Bruce was born Leonard Alfred Schneider on October 13, 1925, on Long Island, New York. Lenny's friend, producer John Magnuson.
Basically, he was born in New York, and he grew up with his mom, and his dad and mom separated when he was young.
Julian Barry researched the comic's life when he wrote the play Lenny.
I think he grew up in a series of motel and hotel rooms with her. Hung around the fringes of jazz and jazz musicians.
Lenny's mother, Sally Marr, was a vaudeville comedienne and his biggest influence. Playboy magazine editor-in-chief Hugh Hefner was friends with Lenny Bruce.
I think she to some extent not only raised but also invented Lenny. She was a wonderful lady with a great deal of chutzpah.
She was very funny. I think a lot of that rubbed off on Lenny.
Comedian Richard Lewis knew Sally Marr in her later years.
She championed Lenny, you know, throughout his career. She was the hippest woman I have ever met.
Lenny agreed and followed in the footsteps of his show business mother. And in his early 20s, Leonard Schneider changed his name to Lenny Bruce.
His first performances were on Arthur Godfrey's Talent Scouts on radio and then television, and there was a touch of the later Lenny in there.
One day, nobody really knows how, he made the transition from doing mother-in-law jokes to just standing up and saying what he really saw. And in a way, I think he revolutionized comedy because nobody else had done that. Nobody.
But I would say his appeal began when he started opening for strip shows in Strip City here in L.A. There were no comedy clubs.
For the next 5 years, Lenny Bruce performed at strip clubs around the country, developing his comic timing. And wouldn't you know it, 25-year-old Lenny also developed an attraction for a young stripper named Honey Harlow.
They fell madly and instantly in love. Love at first sight.
Just a few months after they met, Lenny and Honey married on June 15, 1951.
After they got married, Lenny really didn't like the idea of her stripping.
In 1953, Lenny convinced Honey to give up stripping and try acting. Bruce wrote and starred in a movie called Dance Hall Racket. Honey co-starred. Luckily for his fans, Lenny decided to stick to stand-up. He continued to experiment and improvise new material. Legendary comedian Mort Saul remembers performing with Lenny.
He and I were working together. So we met there, and he was a very, very warm guy. We came along, we broke a few of the rules.
Lenny's rule breaking wasn't confined to the stage.
I think Lenny fell into the trap that a lot of musicians fell into, which was that it was hip to be getting high, and he used heroin. And when he couldn't get heroin, Lenny had prescriptions for anything that gets you high.
For a while, it seemed that Lenny had his drug use under control. Record and media producer Alan Douglas knew Lenny Bruce in the late 1950s.
Well, he wasn't alone. Everybody had that problem. And if you're hanging around nightclubs every night, you're meeting the gangsters and you're meeting the drug dealers and the pimps and all of the people who stay out late at night.
Well, he was doing a lot of things, yeah. A lot of stuff. A lot of needle stuff, too. He never did any of it in front of me.
Many of us were involved in drugs in one way or another.
Including Lenny's wife, Honey. The relationship suffered. Even the birth of their daughter, Brandy Kitty Bruce, on October 7th, 1955, couldn't save the marriage.
You know what it is with everybody? Everybody's salty and everything, and then when they have kids, they realize why nature put them here.
Kitty was the apple of Lenny's eye.
But I know that he adored her and that he ended up raising her by himself. Honey had gone to Hawaii. She was in, you know, some kind of emotional trouble.
She was a junkie. She was a real heavy heroin user.
And Lenny had more or less custody of Kitty.
In 1957, Honey and Lenny were divorced.
And I think Lenny was very disappointed. He never married again. I think he was always very much in love with Honey.
I think that Honey was the love of his life. And I think that when that marriage didn't work, it affected the direction of his life. And there was, I think, to some extent, you know, there was a self-destructive side to Lenny, very clearly in terms of his drug use. I think he was taking heroin at the time.
By the time he was 31, Lenny Bruce was a single parent with a drug problem, a broken heart, and a stand-up routine way ahead of its time. When we come back, Lenny pushes the boundaries, and the boundaries push back. Comedian Lenny Bruce was addicted to drugs and motivated by laughter. Being divorced from his stripper wife and taking care of their only daughter made life tough for the Trailblazer. But by 1960, the 34-year-old funny man was finding an audience for what his critics called sick humor.
His real break came in San Francisco at a club called Ann's 440.
And I went with two friends to the West Coast, and on one of my very first visits to California. And we saw him one night there, and were blown away by him.
Hugh Hefner, you know, had a great deal to do with enlarging Lenny's audience.
I decided to do a television show called Playboy's Penthouse, and I wanted Lenny very much for that first show, and he agreed to do it as a favor.
If I start to really analyze my humor, I guess every bit of it stems from some societal problem or people's concept that I think is hypocrisy.
Lenny was really making a name for himself with his unique mix of social satire and carnal comedy. The only problem was that name was frequently mentioned in obscenity complaints to the police. By 1961, the cops often showed up at Lenny's sold-out performances.
He got arrested in San Francisco.
It was an obscenity bust. I mean, the legal definition of obscenity is very strange. It has to do with the standards of the community. I don't know how anybody can define what the standards of the community are.
Lenny went to court on the misdemeanor charge, but the jury was on his side.
He was found not guilty of obscenity.
But Lenny's problems were just beginning. A few months after he beat the rap in San Francisco, Lenny was busted after a performance in Los Angeles. Sheriff Sherman Block made the arrest.
At that time, in 1962, a sergeant in the sheriff's vice bureau, and I was assigned to what was known as the morals squad, which dealt with things such as prostitution, lewd conduct, and obscenity.
It was clear that not everybody loved Lenny.
There were citizen complaints to which we were obligated to respond.
The complaints claimed Lenny used profanity, which he admitted. LA prosecutors thought they'd nailed the comic.
Because I never denied what the content of my act was. The question is it in violation of the law or not? And he says, I don't believe this jury's going to convict me. And after a 2-week trial, there was a hung jury on the case, and the DA decided not to refile the case.
So far, Lenny was still beating the system. He even won over the arresting officer.
His comments on social issues and on things that were going on in the world were just brilliant. You know, I was really impressed with the guy.
But how long could Lenny's good fortune last? Coming up, Lenny Bruce locks horns with cops, courts, and the Catholics. Welcome back to Mysteries and Scandals. I'm A.J. Benza. By 1962, legendary stand-up comic Lenny Bruce was taking on all the taboo topics: sex, religion, and politics. So obviously the guy had plenty of enemies. Now, Lenny liked to use four-letter words in his act. And we're talking about your basic, everyday, getting stuck in traffic kind of profanity. But cops from coast to coast were looking to bust him on obscenity charges. You see, the authorities had their own agenda.
Busting Lenny Bruce could be good publicity for a politician or a district attorney or a cop.
It was the early 1960s, and Lenny Bruce was fair game.
What offended the powers that be was some of his comments about religion. And that certainly was a problem in Chicago.
In December of 1962, Lenny was performing in a popular nightclub in the Windy City.
I'm convinced that that was where most of his trouble started.
And he began doing things about, jokes about the Catholic Church.
My concept of Catholicism was that it's a rich, rich church and there's poverty, so there was hypocrisy.
Which really wasn't heard of in that day, and made a lot of Irish cops very unhappy.
That's not the basis for any kind of legal action, so, you know.
They didn't go after him for that. They went after him for obscenity. That was it. They nabbed him in Chicago.
He got into the wagon. He was in with two cops in the patrol wagon.
The patrolman said to him, "Well, I'm sorry to have to arrest you, but you were using a homosexual term."
And then he said to the cop, "Have you ever had oral sex with your wife?" That cop said, "Certainly not." So Lenny says, "Well, I feel sorry for you, man." So now they wanted to throw him in and throw the key away.
Lenny had his share of enemies, but he also had his allies.
The notion that language itself, or free speech or thought, could put somebody in jeopardy or put somebody in prison in America is unthinkable now, and was for me unthinkable then.
For all the guys that talk about how wonderful Lenny is, it was Hugh Hefner that wrote the check. Let's not forget him.
Hefner helped pay for Lenny's defense.
I gave him my lawyer, Maury Rosenfield.
During the Chicago trial, the judge cautioned the comic against further use of profanity in upcoming performances.
So Lenny went back into the club that night, and he did the same routine, but he left out the specific words, and he inserted the words blah, blah. He said, if any of you found the word blah, 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 offensive, then you're full of blah, and I hope you never get your blah, blah again. But everyone knew what he meant. And then he concluded that this was one of the dirtiest shows he'd ever done.
It was wonderful. You had to see it.
Lenny was convicted on the misdemeanor obscenity charge. He remained free while his appeal was pending, but his luck was running out, and it was affecting his career.
They made it impossible for him to work in the 60s. They arrested him in so many places and threatened the licenses of the clubs that he worked in.
Attorney Martin Garbus, author of Tough Talk, represented Lenny.
By the time Lenny came to see me, he had been arrested several times. He had also been hounded a great deal. Lenny, at that time, was nearly unable to work anywhere. The only place that Lenny could still work was New York. He came to New York, he tried to work, and as soon as he started to work, he was arrested.
Lenny was used to getting busted, but this time he was out of cash.
His legal fees were mounting. He had to pay his Chicago lawyers. He had people pressing him for money, Honey, his mother, other people. So Lenny was going down a hole. Each time there was another prosecution, it made him less able to work in another particular place.
In 1964, Lenny appeared in New York City before a grand jury. Gerald Harris was working in the district attorney's office.
I was assigned by the DA's office to prosecute Lenny Bruce for giving the so-called obscene performance, and I listened to his tape, and I found it quite funny and on target in terms of social mores and foibles that he was aiming at, and I tried to persuade the bureau chief and the superiors in the office that this was an inappropriate prosecution in my view.
For a brief moment, it looked like Lenny had found another ally.
I was overruled, and I was told that we ought to let the grand jury decide.
The grand jury heard an audio tape of Lenny's performance.
It would have been unseemly for me to break up laughing as I'm prosecuting this case, so I was biting my lip. And as I looked at him, and I realized that I can't go ahead with this. I can't prosecute. I can't be Lenny Bruce's prosecutor. I think he's funny. I think he's not obscene, and I can't continue with the prosecution.
The grand jury handed down an indictment. Gerald Harris removed himself from the case, and another DA took over the prosecution. High school dropout Lenny Bruce decided to become a legal expert to assist with his own defense.
He literally became a student of the law. He read the law, he read the cases, he obtained the transcripts of his trial.
He spent a lot of time. He became quite a good lawyer himself.
Well, I think what happened with Lenny is that he became completely fixated or obsessed with the legal system, with his trial, with the law of obscenity.
Lenny felt that if he could just talk to the judge and do his act for the judge,
I want to testify right now. I want to do the show for the court.
that the judge would fall down laughing and understand him and forgive him, which is not what ever happened.
What happened was no laughing matter. Lenny was convicted.
Lenny Bruce was thereafter sentenced to a jail term. As I recall, it was about 4 months.
He certainly didn't want to go to jail for 4 months. But when he got out, he'd be in the same problem, unable to play.
For a comedian, being unable to play to an audience is the worst fate imaginable, or so it would seem. You see, fate wasn't through tormenting Lenny. When we continue, Lenny Bruce faces a prison sentence, and it's the least of his problems. By 1964, 39-year-old Lenny Bruce had been convicted twice of obscenity charges. While on appeal, few clubs would risk booking Lenny, so his lucrative career went down the toilet. Consequently, he faced poverty in addition to prison.
It became clear, and later in '64, that the New York obscenity arrest and conviction was going to really upset what he would do the rest of his life.
Before his appeal was decided, he fell deeper into depression and drug use.
Now, some might say it was drugs. I don't think so. I think it was his worry about the court case. And taking on New York State like that, and you're bankrupt.
And it meant a great deal to Lenny, I think, to own a nice big house in Hollywood. And I think he was very distraught that he was losing it.
He was bankrupt because that's the legal thing he had to do, because he was just getting nailed from all sides.
He couldn't believe the injustice. It wasn't like he was pounding on he was really crying. He was saying, how can they get away with that? That's because, as a comedian, he had never considered the real inequity of the law or the prejudice of the majority. And when he came to grips with it, he was deeply hurt.
On August 3rd, 1966, the hurting stopped. No one saw it coming. Lenny died alone in his Hollywood Hills home. He was 40 years old.
It was reported he died of an overdose of heroin.
I died in the toilet with a needle in his arm.
He was naked in the bathroom floor, and reporters came in 2 at a time and took pictures, and it was that sort of morbid curiosity.
The irony is, Lenny never knew that ultimately he'd be vindicated.
I think that in each of the cases, eventually, the convictions, when there were convictions, were overturned, but unfortunately some of them were posthumous. They came after he was dead.
Lenny's death left a huge void. His 11-year-old daughter, Kitty, went to live with his mother, Sally Marr, and his passing affected everyone, from friends to arresting officers.
I think he really wanted to challenge the system. That's the way he was.
Eugene McCarthy used to say, if you're going to be a martyr, you've got to be like Jesus. You have to die and everybody's sorry. But you can't hang around and say to everybody, I was right. They hate that.
He was on the scene at the wrong time. On the other hand, maybe his timing was right, because maybe it was Lenny who was making it possible for modern performers and comedians to have the kind of freedom that they have today.
Lenny had a great nose for crap. That's what made him Lenny Bruce. I mean, he could smell it a mile away. He could smell it in liberals and conservatives and every other stripe politically.
But Lenny had this freedom. He had a gift for humor, he had this freedom, and he wasn't afraid to say how he felt.
He wanted to be a comedian, and he was one of the best.
I miss him so much. The crazier American society gets, the more I miss him, because I know he would be just going wild now.
He broke the mold. You know, there is one Lenny, there will always be one Lenny.
He was a truth teller, but he did it in a way that was both hilarious and insightful and tremendously moving. I loved him, and I miss him.
He was a comic and a con man, a philosopher and a phenomenon. Lenny Bruce revolutionized the world of comedy but never knew the magnitude of his legacy. I'm A.J. Benza. Join me the next time we investigate Hollywood's heroes and hellraisers on Mysteries and Scandals.